Welcome to Spirited Straight Talk, the ultimate podcast for anyone who is ready to live a life with intention and help from spirit. I am your host, Deb Shepard, spiritual teacher, medium, and author, helping you open up to the whole enchilada, or like we like to say, the soul enchilada, so you can truly make your soul rise. So let's go. Welcome everybody to Spirited Straight Talk. Once again, I'm here with my partner, Dana. And we talked about this in the very beginning, that we wanted to have you share your story with our audience because you began sharing it in some of our workshops, just to kind of give people an understanding how things work as we're teaching, or especially our Souls Contracts classes. And I know when Dana and I first met, she had come to see me because she brought a staff of her employees from a business she owned and had followed me for a long time, I guess. One of my students, Josephine, had given you my information after your grandma passed.
Yeah, and I think that was about when you took a break because you were very overwhelmed and you were having seizures at the time. So I didn't see you for a little while, but all of a sudden an event popped up. And I
Were
thought,
you a stalker?
oh, cool.
No.
You think you have all these stalkers.
No, I'm just kidding.
But yeah, I just saw this event pop up and thought, oh, I recognized your name from your time on radio and from Josephine sharing about you. And I thought that would be really fun. So I took a group of 6 girls to see you at your little event. Yeah. And had a great time, and of course thought, oh, that would be really cool to have you come and do a private event for us. And then also after that, we talked about you teaching them, doing a little workshop about energy, which was really fun.
Yeah. And I never do exchanges, but we exchanged some of our work, which was enjoyable. And I just kept getting so comfortable and attracted, which I didn't realize, to Dana's soul. And the rest is sort of history.
You stalked me.
Yeah, I did. I told her things for my own desires. Agenda. That's a great way to say it. And as you get to know somebody, you start sharing your little history of your life, and we would share. And Dana started sharing a few things with me, but didn't really go deep. She was, I'm going to say, kind of protected.
Yeah, for sure.
And one of the questions I think is always important is, why didn't you share all of it then? I mean, what happened in the past that you thought, I can only share this amount?
Well, first of all, this story is a bit crazy. If you've ever read the book, A Child Called It, when I read that book, and I as an adult, I came across it one day in a Target store, and I picked it up, and I started reading it. I bought the entire set, which is of 3 books, and I sat in the car. I was, a sales rep at the time, so I was out and about. I sat in the car, and I read the book in about an hour. Speed reading, of course.
And who's the author? Is it?
Dave Pelzer.
Yeah, I think he's a speaker as well these days.
But that book is a bit similar to my story. There are differences, but it was crazy. It was a tough childhood. And of course, when you have a tough childhood, it comes forward with you. And so there's lots of things you have to work through. And I think one of the biggest reasons I didn't share it all was because of judgment and experiences when I would share it, experiences that I had with people judging me and then using the story against me in a way. In particular, my last relationship was one that was very hurtful. And I was told, your parents didn't even love you, so how can I love you? So things like that, experiences like that really taught me throughout my life to shut it down and not talk about it. But in addition, I didn't want my story to be my identity.
Right.
It was just my childhood. I didn't want people to look at me and see that. I didn't want them to see what happened to me versus who I am.
It's shame.
Ton of shame.
Yeah.
I mean, there were things that not only I had to do to survive that brought shame, but also things that happened to me that brought shame. And I know lots of people go through this. This is not an unusual story in the sense that lots of people go through these experiences, but this was my story, and I decided to draw a line of not sharing it because it was just too hurtful.
It's like it takes your power away.
Yeah. And on the flip side, when I would share it, it was so emotional, I would immediately begin to shake because I couldn't get it out.
Body tremors.
I could never express it, just in tiny bits and pieces. I couldn't sit and talk about my story because it was way too emotional. So even now, talking about it, I can feel my insides kind of shaky a little bit, but I've gotten stronger about being able to share it being able to share it knowing that I'm not going to have to deal with the judgment part of it.
And we're not going to use it against you later.
Right.
And when Dana has shared pieces of her story at some of our workshops, everyone is so grateful for her being brave and being transparent and giving them the ability to feel like they can share without judgment. And what I think I'm good at is holding that energy and space for people to share without me judging even the people that did it, the accusers or the people that were the perpetrators, because that's not my journey or my purpose. And so over time, as Dana realized that she could trust this process and got the ability to say, don't have pity for me, or whatever words you've created to be able to let people know how to respond. Because when someone hears a sad story, we want to do something to help you heal, and that's not what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's the last thing I want is somebody to look at me and have pity for me.
Right.
I'm learning over time, over the last 5 years, I'm learning that there's more power in my story than I thought. And I'm learning that by sharing and allowing people to see, giving them a glimpse into how I've handled it can help them.
Correct.
And that's the only reason for sharing.
So one of the things we start at is when you were born, your parents, your biological parents. You want to share that?
Yeah. So my biological parents were very, very young. They were 15 and 16. I know that my father was left alone a lot at the time, and he got into trouble. And they had me. They chose to have me. And my grandparents on my dad's side, they were living with them at the time. And I think everything was fine for my first year. They just were figuring it out. My parents lived with my grandparents, and I was very spoiled, very well taken care of.
Very loved.
My mom was there at the time, but she ended up leaving and going on a hitchhiking journey with another man. And this man happened to be my dad's cousin. And so she was kind of forced out, and my grandparents wouldn't let her take me on the road.
Thank goodness.
Right. Thank goodness on lots of different levels. But what happened is my father, of course, was very young and still in school and trying to get his life together. He allowed my grandparents, his mom and dad, to have custody of me. I know there was a big battle about that, which grandparents were going to get custody of me. And it came down to the judge was not going to move me from one grandparent's household to another, so he left me where I was.
And you were safe.
I was safe, yeah. So my grandma and grandpa essentially became my mom and dad. And they had me till I was 4. My mom was gone from the picture, I think, at that point. I don't remember her ever, and I do have memories of that time. I know that my father came to visit occasionally. I remember him teaching me how to crawl backwards downstairs, and there's a few little spotty memories I have, but it was all of my grandma and grandpa. And of course my aunts and uncles were involved as well and present, but my father really wasn't, and my mother wasn't at all. So they had custody of me. Life was going along great. And he met a woman who was going to, convinced him somehow that they needed custody of me, that he should be raising his own daughter. I was very spoiled. I was a brat, all of this stuff. And so they were
Their
convinced,
perception.
their perception, they were convinced that they needed custody of me. And I was probably pretty bratty. I hear stories of when I was a child, and I was a very strong-willed child. I was very bossy.
Which kept you going, though. That really was a good tool to have.
I guess at the time, they really, my grandparents really didn't shut that down in me. They allowed me to be strong-willed, which probably played into my strength to get through what was coming. So anyway, I was 4 years old. They went through a court battle. My grandparents and my aunts and uncles fought to keep me where I was, from what I understand. But the judge gave custody to Russell,
Your dad.
my father. Yeah. And I remember the night they took me away. I was 4 years old, and my grandma was crying. And I was like, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "Well, you have a new mommy now." And I think that there's a few things that led up to them finally taking me. Like, they would take me on day excursions and stuff to build a relationship, I think was their purpose. So I remember those. But they came one night, and my grandma was forcing my shoes on my feet and had to hand me over. And I was screaming and crying and throwing the biggest fit. I remember this. I got in the car, and we stopped at a store, and I was used to going with them. So I don't think that was unusual, but what was happening I knew was unusual. And I think we probably would stop prior to this, and my dad would get candy or whatever. And here I am, 4 years old, and he went into a store. And I asked my stepmom if he was going to get me candy. And I'm still crying. And she turned and she said, "You don't deserve anything." And I sat back, and I remember thinking, this is bad. I was bad, and this is bad. And I remember thinking that at the time as a 4-year-old. And that began my journey with what happened. So,
And from what I remember, the first little while was okay.
the first 2 years, yeah. The first 2 years, I remember things that were tough. Like, I think at 4, I remember kindness during those 2 years as well, though. So I know there were some good times during those first 2 years. But then my sister was born. And when she was born, I remember things dramatically changing. My dad worked nights, and stepmother worked days. And I remember that I would be there sometimes during the day, and I would be taking care of my sister as a 6-year-old, and she was probably 6 months old at the time, from what I remember. I could barely pick her up, is what I remember, but I would feed her, and because my dad was sleeping. And at some point in that time, we moved to a new house, and I believe my stepmother, she was working days, and she was pregnant, I think, again at the time. So they were looking for a new house. We got a new house, and she had my brother. And I was probably around the age of 7 or 8 at the time, close to 8. And that's when abuse began. She had her 2 kids, and I became the stepchild, and didn't deserve anything. Around 8, like I said, the abuse began. And I remember it starting with having to stand in the corner and having to do chores, and if they were not done quote unquote right, I would not be able to join the family for meals. I wouldn't get meals. And it started that way. It started a little slowly, but still wrong. And so I would have to stand in the corner for hours on end with my hands above my head sometimes, or on my head, almost like I was a criminal. And it began almost like a breakdown of my spirit, so that they would gain compliance, I think. I was not an outspoken child at this point, because I think they had already kind of broken me of that strong-willed, outwardly strong-willed attitude that I had as a little girl. So I think it began innocently enough in the sense that nobody would know what was going on. It was very hidden. It was small things like that.
And even though you're still really young, still during that time, people didn't discuss what child abuse looked like or neglect. Even teachers were not told what to look for.
Well, teachers have no clue. At the time, they had absolutely no clue what to look for, how to react to things. I think it became more visible by the time I was 11. So it took probably 3 years to be like, oh my God, what is going on? Yeah. And I think that there were certain things that happened. Some of the bigger things that I remember was, first of all, the food deprivation. And I stopped growing at the age of 11. So when I finally escaped, they did a bone scan, and my bones stopped growing at 11. So I had been deprived of so much nutrition that my body just paused. It like hit a pause button, and it didn't grow. And so I was wearing like size 6X clothes. I was probably 80 pounds. And my sister later shared with me her viewpoint, and she said that I did look like I was a Holocaust survivor at the time, or a Holocaust victim, because I was so tiny. And so
just you could see the bones.
Yeah. So, this was a real thing for them to deprive me of food. It gave them some sort of joy, is all I can think of.
Can you talk a little bit about where they made you sleep in your room a little bit?
So I think what ended up happening is I started to sneak out to get food. So I would sneak out of my room, and, could be in the middle of the night or whatever it was. And I would go steal, as they would say, a piece of bread or something like that. Anything that I could get away with thinking that maybe they wouldn't notice.
And sneaking out means into the kitchen.
Meant, walking up the stairs from my room into the kitchen. And so they would notice missing food, I think, is how this began. Well, they started locking me in my room. And they started to... They secluded me away from the family with the punishment of not eating. But then when they noticed that I was maybe sneaking food on occasion, they started to lock me in my room. So they put a padlock on the door.
And you were in the basement at that time.
I was in the basement in a room. And I had, very little. I had a bed, and I had a set of books that were given to me by my stepmother's parents years before, probably when I was about 8. And so I had that in my room, and a dresser that had a few clothes in it, and that was it.
If I remember correctly, didn't at one time they took the mattress and you would just have the box springs?
I don't know if it seems like they at one point did something happen with the mattress, but I may or may not remember that correctly, to tell you the truth. I remember a lot, but not all of my memories are 100% clear. Yeah, I think you block things. But that's kind of when the food stuff started, was around the age of 8, and it got progressively worse all the way throughout. By the time I was 11, I was regularly starved, and I had to fight for every meal. And part of my chore was to take the trash out. And there are times that I had to dig in the trash to see if there was a crust of bread or anything that I could salvage to shove in a pocket.
I remember you telling me this, and it was so hard for you to share because of the shame that came with it. And to me, that was, it hit my heart, where you wanted to survive so much.
I did.
You wanted to still live here and to be able to have to survive like that, and to share it. I'm just so proud of you for having that courage.
Thank you. Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
One of the other big punishments that I would get is I would have to write. I remember taking food one time and I had to write, "I will not steal," 5,000 times. And I could not have anything to eat until I finished that 5,000 times, which took me like 3 or 4 days. And so there were really bizarre things that they would do.
Well, obviously, they're mentally ill, but with that said, you're the one that
Yeah.
had to tolerate it.
Yeah. And I think, that part of it was probably the worst part. I would rather have gotten one of the beatings that they gave me versus being starved. I think the starvation was the really, really tough part to endure mentally.
Right.
Because you can literally go mad from hunger. Mm-hmm. And I think that was
you're
probably...
a growing child.
Mm-hmm. I think that was the part that was tough. But
Some of the
physical
beatings,
punishments, the physical punishments were bad, and they were constant. It wasn't... I didn't go a day, hardly, without...
Primarily by your father, but demanded by your stepmother.
Yeah, it would depend on what my supposed crime was for the day, whatever the crime was, whether it was I spoke to one of my siblings out of turn, I wasn't allowed to speak to them. I was called she or it most of the time, not by my name, just she. And I was...
You were not able to play games with them. If they were playing games, you were not allowed to.
I was not allowed to be near them, talk to them. I was literally a prisoner in the room. I was isolated. And they were told that I was bad and they were not to talk to me. And if I were to speak to them, they were supposed to report this. And so that's how life was. It just was not allowed. So the infraction that I created could have been anywhere from speaking a word all the way up to not doing my chores correctly, or not having good enough grades, which at the time I was an honors student in several different honors classes.
Even with all this going on.
Yeah, well, that's the only entertainment I had. The entertainment I had was to read my textbooks, because that's what I had access to. So while I was locked in my room, or whatever the case was, shut in my room, I would read my school books, because that's all I had. That's all I could do. So, of course, that's what my focus was then. But yeah, it was crazy, being isolated all the time. I remember certain instances where my stepmother talked about stealing food, and she held my hand to a burning hot stove. There was a red element, and she put my hand on it, and I fought her. Like, I kept pulling my hand away, but she burned me. She put my hand to the stove and burned me, and said that in the Middle East they would cut my hand off for taking a piece of bread.
And this is supposed to be a mother.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember one instance, she threw a fork at me and it stuck in my leg, and then...
And I think you still have a scar from that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not laughable, but...
Well, I think laughter, like I always say, it helps shift the vibration.
Right.
And if you think back to someone doing that, and it wasn't an accident. It wasn't one of your siblings doing that.
No.
But I do know some of your siblings kind of followed your parents.
Yeah. I mean, that's the example they were shown. Mm-hmm. One of my siblings, my sister, who is closest in age to me, she would actually shove whatever she could in her pockets, whether it was a pizza crust or just the crust off of her bread or anything that she thought she could sneak without getting caught, into her pockets, and she would shove it under the door. And I think there were times that probably kept me alive, especially in the summertime, that probably kept me alive. She remembers now when we talk about it, I know she has a lot of guilt because she stopped doing that at one point, because I think part of it was she was afraid to get caught and it was so stressful for her. But some of the things she's talked about with me as well is one time in particular when my father was in my bedroom, and I don't remember what I had done, but it was probably one of the times where he was being badgered by my stepmother to take action of some sort with me. And he came into my room and began to beat me. And after about a half hour of this, my sisters said that he came out of the room. She said she was sitting on the couch the entire time, hearing what was going on, and thought that he was going to kill me this time. And so she was terrified. And he came out, she said, and sat on the couch as if he had just ran a mile. I remember this, but she said after about 5 or so minutes, she heard me breathe and cry. And that wasn't the only time that happened. He was very severe with me. He would beat me as if I was a grown man. So closed fist punches.
Didn't he have some boots that were
steel toe boots
that
he would kick me with those? Yeah,
which we think now affected your
liver.
Your liver,
yeah,
to this day.
I went through some Ayurveda healing, and we talked about my overall health and things that had happened to me in my childhood. And this comes from a holistic perspective of healing, not just physical body, but mentally as well. And during that session with this Ayurveda healer, we talked about this. And she said she felt that my liver issues came from an injury in childhood, which I will always have.
You can't
some
fix
things that I can't fix because of it. Yeah, the malnutrition
and even your joints and
my joints, fibromyalgia. Mm-hmm. Which that in itself is tons of management of those symptoms, and it's linked to childhood trauma. That's where it comes from. So, I remember some of these things. And around that time too, I remember just little evil things that my stepmother would do just to create these ways that she could see me suffer. So one of them, I remember this humongous snowstorm. It was in the 80s. And I remember, I think the shovel was buried somewhere in the yard, but these drifts were like 5-foot drifts. This was a crazy snowstorm in Colorado back in the 80s. A lot of us remember
that,
And I had to go outside and dig for the shovel with no gloves, and I remember getting frostbite. Yeah, on probably the tips of my ears and my hands. And to this day, I can't handle cold. Like when my hands get cold, they burn very, very badly. And I'm sure it comes from that. But just little things like that would be...
And weren't you out there for hours?
Oh, God. I was not allowed to come in till I found it. I never found it. I don't know what happened where they actually let me live, but I never found the shovel. I remember that. And it's crazy to think about, but that brought up a memory about when this actually started. And I think I remember telling you this, but I remember not being able to, I was kind of a latchkey kid when we first moved into that new house in the beginning of the story, but I couldn't get the door open one day. And my stepmother was at work, my father was at work. I couldn't get the door open, and I had a certain amount of time to get home and a certain amount of time to get inside, and then I would get the phone call to make sure I was home so they could make sure I was safe.
Sort of,
yeah. Well, I couldn't get the door open. And that was the day that I can define that I remember things changing. She had to quit her job because she said I couldn't be trusted to get back and forth from school at 7 years old. And that she had to be home. And I can define that that's really when things changed for the worst. And so that just brought up that memory.
And didn't a neighbor hear you cry or something?
A neighbor heard me crying, yeah. And they called me over to just a neighbor behind. And they called me over and they helped me. They brought me in. I didn't have a phone number to call because I would get the call from the bank where she worked. She would call every day. So the neighbor took care of me, and it created this humongous fight between them and that neighbor that helped. It's almost like they just wanted to seclude and not have people have contact. So it was really bizarre control thing.
Absolutely. They didn't want anyone to know their secrets, which reminds me of the story about, because people have asked you that,
why didn't
someone else intervene, like a school teacher or social services? Because I remember you telling me about even having your shoes taped together because they didn't give you anything for it. That would be, a proper attire. And you want to share the story about the social services.
Well, I was in... Abuse had been going on for a little while, but I was in elementary school still, I believe. I remember social services coming in, so people had an idea of what was going on. It was communicated. I think my grandparents knew something wasn't right, but
they weren't allowed to see you.
They were not allowed to see me. I was secluded from the entire family, and so they secluded themselves and all of us, all the children, including me. I believe probably because of me, because of what was going on, they didn't want anyone to see. I think I heard later it was my grandparents called my mother, my biological mother, told her that there's something wasn't right. She called social services, and social services came to see what was going on. And they went to the school, and they made me strip so they could see if there were bruises anywhere. I mean, it was just bizarre.
But you said that they would do things so that there would be no bruises or they couldn't be found. Wasn't it timing?
That was
or
true.
Something?
That was true. It was timing. Yeah. There were something. I mean, there were lots of times I would show up to school with big signs of abuse, but I was always told when asked that I should the lie. They would give me the lie that I had to share. I ran into a doorknob one time when she got up and one day flew out of her room and just hit me with a belt buckle in the eye. She had a belt in her hand, and the belt buckle hit my eye and gave me a huge welt. Thank God it didn't rip my eye out. But going to school the next day, the lie was that I ran into a doorknob. I mean, who would believe that nowadays? But back then, 35 years ago, yeah. And I remember one time, I can't remember what it was for because it happened so often, but used a belt on me, and I had bruises from the top of my backside all the way down to the back of my knees, like humongous welts all the way down. And I had to wear pants all summer because of this. So I remember seeing people and them asking me, why are you wearing pants? It's 100 degrees out. And I couldn't tell them, of course, but I was hiding these horrific
bruises,
welts and bruises. Yeah. And that they didn't go away for probably at least a month.
And you bruise beautifully.
Yeah, still. I turn lots of colors.
Yeah. But the first time, because they came twice, if I recall, in your story.
Well, social services came to the school, and then they started an investigation. And I think at the time, I must have been right around that 11 to 12-year-old. I told them about the lock on my door, mistakenly, because I suffered for it. But I think I shared that, and social services, and I'm trying to remember the timeline. It's tough. So I think it was twice. I think, there was one time they came when I was younger and they didn't find anything. And then there's one time when I ran away, and I told social services at the time more about what was going on, and I told them about the lock on the door, and they got involved again. And the only thing I remember social services taking action on was making them remove the lock from the door. And that was probably when I was about 11. I think the other one was when I was a little bit younger, maybe a year or two younger. Yeah. So there were a couple of times, but social services dropped the ball tremendously on my story and my case.
I agree. One of the stories you've shared with me and we've talked about is the time that your brother, he was a lot younger than you obviously, came into your room jumping on the bed, and what happened with that.
Yeah, I remember this pretty distinctly because this was a big deal. I was really, really sick at the time. And I believe I had laryngitis. I couldn't actually speak out loud.
And they couldn't take you to they wouldn't take you to
They
the
didn't
doctor.
take, yeah, they didn't take me to the doctor.
No medical care.
Yeah. And so I was in my room where I always was, and my brother had just gotten out of the bath, and he might have been 8 or 9, probably 8 at the time, so he was just little. But I was in my room, and he barged in, and he had a towel, and he started jumping on my bed and whipping his towel around above his head. And I went to one side of the room, and I stood against the wall, and I kept saying or whispering, "You've got to get out, you've got to get out. I'm going to get in trouble, you've got to get out." And he was doing, just jumping and laughing. And well, his mother caught him in my room. And even though I was standing against the wall and completely across the other side of the room, he, in order to not get in trouble, told her that I had pulled him into my room. And she turned it into this thing that I was trying to pull him into my room to abuse him somehow.
Assault him. Mm-hmm.
And this happened frequently with my brother, actually. He created situations to get me into trouble quite often. I remember another time that he spit on me, and he got caught spitting on me. And I was wiping it off of my arm, and I gave him a dirty look, and she caught me giving him a dirty look. And she asked me what was going on, so I said he spit on me, and he said, well, she spit on me first.
Which is not true.
Which wasn't true. But this is one of the rare instances I was actually in the car with them. They would take me to soccer games and make me sit in the hot car while they were out doing their soccer, I guess to stop me from stealing food. I don't know. Crazy nutcases, but that's what happened, and I didn't even get out of the car, and I got a beating so bad I was bleeding. I remember bleeding, and I remember him looking at me saying, "I'm so sorry." And but that happened quite frequently. It wasn't,
and especially like in the bedroom situation, didn't they continually accused you of?
Oh yeah,
abuse?
Even as an adult, when I confronted my father, he said this to me, and I completely cut off communication at that point. Even though he was trying to reconnect with me, at that point I said, I'm done. I'm not
doing this.
Not doing it. Not having a relationship. So. Yeah, it's a
now,
bit
this
crazy.
is just a little bit of Dana's story.
This is the first few years.
So what we're going to do is we're going to do another podcast to continue. How did Dana
Part two. I did get away.
She did get
away, of course.
But we want to talk about that, how you've healed, even how family members still want you to forgive.
Yeah.
And those things to really teach other people and share what we say about these kind of journeys and how to heal from them. Because I think that's the important part is, okay, this tragic situation happened. You're here today to talk about it, but what did it take for you to be able to share this with the world, basically?
Yeah.
I'm so proud of you. As I'm sitting here listening to it and remembering these things, I have tears in my eyes, and my heart is so heavy because I love you so much, and knowing that another human being can do that. And like you said, this isn't just you. This happens.
Mm-hmm. It does.
And this is not
it still happens.
Yeah. And you're telling the few stories, not every single one that has occurred to you. But I'm really proud of you.
You keep telling me I have to write a book.
I do. But I'm proud of you. We're going to do part 2. So make sure that you listen to the second podcast of Dana's Courage. To be here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Love you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Spirited Straight Talk. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you subscribe so that you get notified of new shows. We'd also love it if you'd leave us a review. and let's connect. Visit debshepard.com for more insights, support, workshops, and to book a session with Deb. Plus, enter to get a free reading with Deb. All you have to do is sign up for the email list and you'll automatically be entered. Just go to debshepard.com. That's DEBSHEPPARD.com.